If you'll take your Bibles this morning, open to James chapter 4. We are making it through here, our study in the book of James. James chapter 4. Is everybody staying warm enough today? Yes? Good. It was very cold coming in. I see some of you still have coats on. It's a little chilly in the auditorium this morning, isn't it? That may be by intention. I'd rather have it chilly than warm, because when it's warm, you fall asleep during my sermons. Okay? I see you. Yes, I look around, I see, so we'll keep it a little bit cooler in here today. I'm not even taking my coat off. This is the closest thing I have to a Carhartt. It's right here. I didn't grow up in Iowa. I'm still trying to get my Iowa card. You got to have a Carhartt to really be an Iowan, right, Jonathan? So I'm doing my best, all right? I'm doing my best here today. But James chapter 4, I'm going to walk through some verses here this morning. So good, so rich, helps us understand a lot about our lives. James continues to circle around his theme for the book, and if you would summarize the theme for the book, you could say it something like this. I feel like I come up with a different way to say it every Sunday. When the squeeze comes in life, what's going to come out of you? So take chapter 1, all the trials, everything going on. You say, when the squeeze comes, now I say when the squeeze comes in life, it's really not when. It is always. The squeeze in life is always there. How many of you feel like, you don't have to raise your hands, how many of you feel like you're in a squeeze right now? There's something pressuring you in your life right now. You know, all of us have that going on. So when that squeeze comes, and it's always perpetual, what comes out of you? Is it faith? Is it the reality of your faith? Or is it sinful desires and sinful reactions? That's what James is trying to help us understand, that life is all about a squeeze, and you can't use that as an excuse to sin. That what happens in those squeezing moments is the reality of your heart. And as you go back to chapter 1, James says there's kind of three key factors of someone who is the real deal with their faith. Someone who's really has the faith, the Lord Jesus Christ. When the squeeze comes in life, you will be a person that is a controlled tongue, a person who has a compassionate heart, and a person that has a clean life. He gives us kind of a three-point outline, and he just circles around those themes over and over again. So you're at your kid's soccer game, and you highly disagree with the call that the ref made. There's the squeeze. What comes out? Okay? Think about it like that. Think about it like this. You're at a table at a diner, and there's a ketchup bottle there, mustard bottle, other condiments sitting there, ketchup bottle sitting on the table, and you reach over that ketchup bottle, and for some reason, or let's say your kid does this, just decided to squeeze the daylights out of that ketchup bottle, and suddenly, right, we've got a first grade nightmare happening there at the table. Ketchup's going everywhere. Now, at this moment, the ketchup bottle is very embarrassed in front of his friend, the mustard bottle. Very embarrassed in front of all the other things there at the table. And he says, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. The reason that happened is because that person squeezed the bottle. That's why this happened. The mustard bottle looks over and says, yeah, but what came out of you is what's inside of you. You can't blame the person squeezing the bottle, because what came out was what was inside of you. Okay? So that's what James continues to try to help teach us. And so when there's things in our lives, when there's sinful responses, why did that happen? Well, it happened because I was under a lot of pressure. No, that happened because that's what's inside of you. What does a ketchup have inside the ketchup bottle? They have ketchup inside, right? So what happens when you squeeze the ketchup bottle? What comes out? Ketchup comes out. And so when the squeeze in life comes in your life, what comes out of you? What comes out is what's in your heart. And so we come to this next section here, and he continues on this track. Now, this is a bit of a jarring transition, because we've been in chapter 3. If you go back to chapter 3, verse 17 and 18, this is what he says. But wisdom from above is first pure, then peace-loving and gentle and compliant, full of mercy and good works, unwavering without pretense. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who cultivate peace. And so we end chapter 3. It's this nice, peaceful, sow peace, be a peaceful person, love peace, interact with peace with the people around you. And then suddenly we come to chapter 4, and it's this. What is the source of wars and fights from among you? You're like, where did that come from? Maybe James was writing this epistle. He went to lunch. He came back. Maybe he was in a bad mood, or, why suddenly the shift? Well, it does make a lot of sense because he's talked about sowing peace and people that sow peace and needing to sow peace. And then he looks at the church here, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Verse 1 there, he looks at the church and he says, now let's take this to the streets. Let's see how this really lives in your life. What is the source of these wars and fights? And he's pointing out actual wars and fights in this church, in the churches that he's writing to. There were different wars and fights. There was jockeying for position. There were people that wanted prominence. There was a mistreatment of poor people, actual wars and fights. And James says, yes, sow peace, be people of peace. But then he points and says, so why do you have all these wars and fights among you? And what he's going to teach us here in chapter 4 is that you cannot live your Christian life with one foot in the world and one foot in God's stuff and think it's going to go okay for your life. That is a very wobbly fence to sit on. And that wobbly fence looks like wars and fights from among you. And so he asks that question, chapter 4, verse 1. What is the source of wars and fights from among you? And I look at you today, and I ask you that same question. What is the source of wars and fights and disagreements and tension and quarreling and arguments in your lives today? Does anybody here have any tension in your life in any of your relationships? Anybody have any of that going on? And so I ask you that question. What's the source of it? Now, I would very much encourage you this morning to listen in. These verses, James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, by the way, we're not going to really get very far. I'm just going to warn you about that. I had hopes to get a little bit further. We're not going to get very far because there's a lot of stuff here in these verses. But as we read through these and talk through this, I just want you to be aware this text, this sermon, literally can change your life. Now, you look up to me, you say, Pastor Mike, every one of your sermons changes my life. Thank you. I look back at you and I say, liar. No, but this one really, listen to this one, okay? Don't listen to any other sermons I preach. Listen to this one. This one really has the chance to change your life and change your relationships and change your marriage and change your own heart. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Are there wars and fights in churches today? Are there wars and fights in our families? Absolutely. I heard a story of a church recently that the entire board resigned, and none of the church members knew that this was going to happen until the board had resigned. And the reason they resigned is because they claimed that there were certain power players in the church that were circumventing the board, and that the pastor was listening to the power players instead of listening to the board members of the church. Well, the congregation was surprised by this, and over the course of a few months, the attendance of the church dropped by 45%, and the church was in an absolute mess after that. Does that happen today? Yeah, it happens today. A dad looked out at his backyard and around the swing set, and his kids were out there with some neighborhood kids, and they were in a heated argument. And the dad walks out to try to referee this heated argument in the backyard, and as he got close, the daughter turns and looks and says, "It's okay, Dad, it's okay. We're just playing church." Sometimes our kids see these types of things. Does it happen in your home? Yep, might be a blow up at home, might be a blow up with the kids, with strangers, with friends. It can take various forms. Are there wars and fights inside of your marriages here today? Sure, there has been in the past, and maybe some of you are bringing that into this place this morning. And so James asks the question, and then James gives us an answer in verse 1. I would have to say that here at the end of verse 1, this could be one of the most profound statements in all of the New Testament. If you have a pen in hand, underline this. Or if you have a digital Bible, highlight it in the digital Bible. Not as good as underlining it in a paper Bible. Can I get an amen? Thank you. No, that's just a joke. Look what he says at the end of verse 1. What's the source of wars and fights among you? Look what he says next. Don't they come from your passions that wage war from all the annoying people in your life? Is that how he finishes the statement? Don't they come from your passions? The word passion is a Greek word where we get our English word hedonism from. Hedonism, which is the pursuit of pleasure. It's a philosophy of life that says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die. You've heard that before. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure. And so you see that word there in verse 1. Don't they come from your passions, your desire for pleasure, your desire for comfort, your desire for satisfaction? Those desires, those hedonistic desires that wage war inside of you, and the language is so vivid for our minds to think about those desires of our hearts waging war inside of us. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Answer: it's an inside job. We start right here. Probably one of the most profound statements in all the New Testament. What are those desires that wage war inside of us? I could spend the rest of the sermon listing those desires. Here's examples of some. A desire for status or influence, a desire for financial security, a desire for respect, a desire for peace and quiet, a desire for comfort, for leisure, the desire to have that picture-perfect family that you always hoped for. You could put a lot of things in that blank. And James is saying that's the source of wars and fights from among you, are these desires that are in your heart. You desire something, you protect that desire, and you go on the offensive against people that are hindering that desire from taking place. And so if I were to summarize here, verse 1 and 2 of this chapter, James is trying to say something like this, and I phrase it in such a way that, Lord willing, it's memorable, and it sounds like this. A dissatisfied heart is never at peace. A dissatisfied heart is never at peace. Notice what's not said in that phrase. I did not finish that sentence and say a dissatisfied heart is never at peace with others. I did not say that. I just left it, is never at peace. Why? Because the dissatisfied heart is not at peace, and that starts right here. That starts with ourselves. You could say it this way: a dissatisfied heart is never at peace with itself, it's never at peace with others, and it's never at peace with God. So we're going to look at those three layers this morning: inward, outward, upward. And so what are the results of the dissatisfied heart? As I've just said, the three layers of that. First of all, it's an inward agitation. An inward agitation. And this takes the form in two ways. First, we want to obtain what we don't have. And second, we want to protect. The word should say protect and not obtain. That was my fault. We want to protect what we do have. And I'm pulling this from verse 2, the first phrase of verse 2. Where do wars and fights come from among you? It comes from these warring desires inside your heart, this restless heart that's not at peace because it's dissatisfied. It can't get what it wants. Verse 2, he says it like that. You desire and you do not have. You want and don't have. You desire and aren't satisfied. We are by nature wanters. We want things. We want to be satisfied. And that's what he says, you desire and don't have. The word desire is to lust after. Now that sounds bad when we say it like that, to lust after, but it's not necessarily a bad word in and of itself. It just means to have a desire, to want something. And it could be the desire to be successful. It could be desire to use your gifts and talents. And what we find when we start to dig into the idea of desires is that every desire, most desires are God-given, and most sins start with some kind of a good God-given desire that becomes deformed. So if you look at verse 2, it says, you desire and you do not have. And so at this point, this desire, which could have started as a fine desire, God-given, becomes deformed because it wants this thing more than it wants God. It thinks that this thing will satisfy in a way that only God is able to satisfy. And that's what's going to happen here in the rest of chapter 4. God will not compete. He will not compete for your worship. That's where he goes here in the rest of chapter 4. So what do some of these desires look like that are good and God-given desires that go awry, that become deformed? Well, it could be desires, I said, for success. It could be desire to use your gifts and talents, the desire for relationships, the desire for good food. Can I get an amen? Right? That's a good desire. But can that be abused? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely, right? That can be abused. The desire for leisure, the desire for sexual fulfillment. And it becomes a deformed desire when it gains an outsized importance in your pursuit of happiness, fulfillment, or satisfaction. I want this, and this is everything to me. If I only had this, then everything would be better. If any of you ever had a thought like that, you don't have to raise your hand because everybody should raise their hand at that moment. If only this was different, if I had this, I really think that we would be able to iron out some of these marital conflicts that we're having. If we could just have that, you see. That's how that works. You desire and you don't have. And these desires, like I said, are not necessarily bad. They become bad when it becomes outsized importance, when it becomes God. It becomes a bad desire when we try to fulfill that desire outside of God's boundaries. The desire for sexual fulfillment is God-given, but it becomes a deformed desire when it's fulfilled outside of God's boundaries. And he says here in verse 2 again, you desire and don't have. So is the answer, this is a rhetorical question. I'll just let you know the answer. The answer is going to be no, okay? You desire and don't have. So is the solution to get what you're desiring? And the answer is no. So he says you desire and don't have, and he's saying that's the reason for the wars and fights among you. So if you're not careful, you might read this the wrong way and say, well, James must be teaching us that if I could only get what I desire, then the wars and the fights will go away. That's not what he's saying. You desire and you don't have. He's not saying that you should try to get what you don't have to fulfill that desire. He's saying you're desiring the wrong thing. That's what the problem is. You're desiring the wrong thing. You're desiring the wrong outcome from the thing that you are hoping for. There's a phrase that I've used with my kids at different junctures, and I will pick on my son Elijah today because he's older, and this happened years ago when he was little. Elijah loved Legos. Okay, any kids here this morning? Raise your hand if you like Legos. You got some kids like Legos. Okay, raise your hand if you're an adult. Tony, I see that hand back there. You still love Legos. That's awesome. I remember Elijah loved Legos. He always wanted to get another Lego set. He always had his eyes on the next Lego set that he was going to get. Always another Lego set. Always another one. He had tons of Lego sets. In fact, he had all these Lego sets, and then he would deconstruct them, and I would say to him, you're keeping those separate, right? You're keeping this set, and these pieces go with this set, and you're keeping those separate. Yep, I'm keeping those separate, Dad. Listen, now we've got this giant plastic tub, and they're all in this tub together, And there's no way to tell which pieces go with which set. I mean, it is a first grade crisis. Let me tell you, it is a crisis. All those things, no way to figure out where they go. I just can't look at it. I just have to avoid looking at it. So, giant tub, all these Legos, and so he always wanted another set. I remember going to Target with him, and I'd ask him this question. He'd get this set, and I'd say, all right, sets in his hand, and say, okay, now, this is the last one, right? This is it. You get this one, and you'll be fully satisfied, right? This is it. This is the set to end all sets. You will no longer need any more sets after this one. Am I correct? Of course that's not correct. I heard Tom Brady say the other day in an interview, he said, I won seven Super Bowls, but I'll tell you what, I think more about the 3 that I lost more than the 7 that I won. And I heard him say that, and I thought, that is sad, right? Why? Because win another one, 7 Super Bowls, and he still thinks about the 3 that he lost. With Judah, my second son, I will often say to him, it's just never enough, is it? It's never enough. Now, that phrase may or may not have been inspired by The Greatest Showman. Never enough! Like that. You want to hear more of it? Great lyric. Towers of gold are still too little. These hands, whatever, I can't remember lyrics. My wife's laughing at me. These hands could hold the world and it'll. Rhyme little with it'll. Great lyric writing right there. These hands could hold the world and it'll never be enough. Never be enough. It's such a great lyric, great song, sad song, but a good song because it so accurately describes the human condition. And so what happens? Verse 2, you desire, you do not have. There's inward agitation there. You desire, you do not have. You feel that agitation. You become agitated. You become down. You become gloomy. You become depressed. Now, there's medical reasons for depression. I understand that. But I'd say that a huge reason for people becoming down and depressed is because of what I would say unmet expectations. You desire and don't have, and what that does is it puts a rock on your heart and sinks your heart. James is so wise in describing the human condition here. So you could say it like that. We want to obtain what we don't have, and we want to also, there's another layer of that, protect what we do have. So this comes into bear when you have something and you want to protect it. So there's wars and fights among you because you have something and someone else comes in and threatens that thing. So you have a singer in church that's really good and known as like this singer. He is the best singer in the entire church, and he gets all the lead parts on all the songs in the worship services, and suddenly another singer comes and tries out for the worship team, and he might actually be a little bit better. Oh, tension. Why? Because the first one wants to and likes to have that spot as the best singer, viewed as the best singer. And then suddenly there's tension, there's competition, and there's war, and there's fights that happen between people. Maybe you have a certain image that you want to maintain for your family, and you've done a really good job of maintaining this image for your family. You are the nice, put-together, clean-cut family. Your kids are never the ones that get in trouble. Like, everything's going just fine, and then that one child comes along in your family. You know which one I'm talking about. I see some of you parents looking at that child right now in the pew. That one child comes along. Kind of ruins that whole thing. That child wants to wear what they want to wear. They don't go along with the family matching plan, right? They start getting in trouble in Sunday school and in school, and you get the reports back, and you're like, oh, this is ruining the image that we want. You desire and you can't have. You had something, you're trying to protect it. And so we see the truth of this, the inward agitation. A dissatisfied heart is never at peace. So simple here, these verses. What's the source of wars and fights? Don't they come from your passions that wage war in you? You desire and you do not have. Inward agitation. Well, what happens to inward agitation? Well, that begins to spill over. This is when the sinful desires of our hearts take to the streets and begin to impact those around us. And you can call this outward instigation. So inward agitation boils over into outward instigation. So other people become hindrances or competition to fulfilling your desires, and this can lead to struggle and war and fight and even violence potentially in some cases. Now just imagine with me some scenarios. Think about right now, there's kids in the room, but there's also kids back in the kids' wing. Think about the 2s and 3s class right now, okay? 2s and 3s, that's a great age. 2s and 3s, 4s and 5s, some of those ages, love those ages. You just imagine this kid, this little boy in the class, and he has a toy, and he's really enjoying playing with that toy, and he does not want to share that toy with anybody else. And so far, there's been nobody who's been able to challenge him for that toy. And then this one kid gets dropped off. This larger than normal child gets dropped off. This kid that you look at and you think, are you a descendant of the Nephilim? Do you have 6 fingers on each hand? Like, what is wrong with you? Right? This giant kid comes in, walks up, grabs the toy, and suddenly, what do we have? James chapter 4, verse 1, wars and fights between these 3-year-old kids. Okay? You can see how this works. Why is there a war? Why is there a fight going on? Because both of these kids wants to have control over that toy. What's the desire? The desire is control, and they're challenging each other on that. It's all cute to think about it in terms of little kids, but let's take it into the adult world. You've got a young lady in the youth group, and she enjoys getting 100% of the attention from a young man in the youth group, until another young lady begins to attend a youth group that is cute and charming and takes the attention of this other young boy. And suddenly, what do we have? Wars, fights, gossip, taking sides. Listen, if you're a youth leader, you just need to stay clear. Just get out of there. Just stay clear of this, all right? Oh, you see it with teens. How about with adults? You have 2 moms that are at odds with each other inside of a church, Mom A and Mom B. Mom A begins to gossip about Mom B because Mom B brought her kids to small group with runny noses, and Mom A is accusing Mom B of spreading disease among the kids and begins to gossip. And Mom B says, I've had enough of this, I want to switch small groups. Suddenly, wars and fights. Why? Because of the desires. The outward instigation takes place. James uses strong words here. I want you to see the words he uses as he goes on in verse 2. You desire, do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You murder and covet. You fight and wage war. You do not have because you do not ask. You murder and covet. There's some disagreement on this text. Some people actually think that maybe it was going this far in that church. It's kind of a crazy church to think about. There may have been murder, but I don't think that was actually happening. I think what James is saying is that this fighting is becoming brutal. It's on the brink of violence, and you know that the end result of some of these wars and fights can be murder. James is saying you're on a dangerous path. You're on a path that leads to violence, and you've heard how this can happen. It's like the young guy that gets charged for murder, and he says about his ex-girlfriend who he murdered, if I can't have her, nobody will. You've heard a statement like that from somebody charged in a scenario of murder like that. And so you covet, you murder, and you cannot obtain, you fight, and you wage war, and you see the conflict that begins to explode because of these desires inside of our hearts. And so let's illustrate this here this morning. I want to illustrate this in terms of a marriage just so you can see how this works inside of a relationship. So think about a conflict in marriage. Okay, I'm gonna really stretch here. I'm gonna find something that maybe is just kind of out there that you can't relate to. Let's say there's conflict over differing financial priorities. I know it's a stretch, right? I know you've never. I'm kidding, of course. I'm kidding. Right? Not much of a stretch. Some of you probably experienced this, differing financial priorities, and suddenly there's conflict between husband and wife. And so because of these differing financial priorities, you begin to have defensive and offensive weapons against each other in this fight. And so let's draw this up for you, starting with the wife. She's building this wall of defensive weapons. And she stands behind this wall of defensive weapons: self-righteousness, avoidance, fear. Okay, you could stack this wall higher and higher. This is the wall of defensive weapons. Husband, he begins to stack up his wall of defensive weapons, and he gives the silent treatment. He runs away. He goes and holes up in the garage to get away from her, pretending like he has a project that he's working on, and really he's just sitting in the garage trying to get away from her, okay? You see how this might work. What's the problem? What's the source of wars and fights from among you? Well, simple. You come into counseling, you say, we're having financial problems. He sees it this way, I see it this way. This is the problem. And then there becomes arrows that fly, offensive weapons. And he shoots the arrow of anger and harshness, and she shoots the arrow back of manipulation. In the first service, one husband just started laughing uncontrollably at this point, and I pointed, I'm like, you're on a very dangerous path there, my friend. He shoots the arrow of accusatory words. She shoots the arrow back of coldness, relational coldness. He shoots the arrow of harshness and scowls towards her. She shoots the arrow back of, I think we just need separate accounts to solve this problem. He says, oh yeah, well, I'll go do this. I'm going to go buy that smoker that I've always wanted because it's, going to help our family, right? You start to get in this battle, defensive weapons, offensive weapons. Come into the counseling room. Hey, we're having problems in our marriage. Really, what's the problem? Well, we've got differing financial priorities. Oh, okay. Is that actually the problem? Yeah, that's the problem. We can't agree on these financial priorities. All right, let's see what the book of James says. Because when I read verses 1 and 2 of James chapter 4, I don't find financial priorities listed in here. And James says, what's the source of wars and fights from among you? He says, don't they come from your passions that wage war? So I'm going to look at this husband, I'm going to look at this wife, and I'm going to say to them, all right, you're saying the problem is the financial issues, and really the financial issues is just the squeeze that's coming around the ketchup bottle. What's actually happening here? What's actually happening is you have husband and wife that are protecting something. What are they trying to protect? They're trying to protect desires. As we read about in James chapter 1, don't they come from your passions that wage war inside of you? You desire and you cannot have. For the wife, she's trying to protect this desire of security. For her, she wants security above all else. And so she builds the defensive wall and shoots the offensive arrows to protect her desire of security. For him, of course, what does any guy want? Comfort and fun, right? I want the smoker, I want the car, I want the whatever. Some of you guys are like, that's not me, that's her. No, it's okay. It's mostly you, all right? You're each trying to protect this desire. You see, the problem, the source of the conflict is not the financial issues. The source of the conflict is the desire in your heart that you're trying to protect from the other person. So what's the answer to this conflict? Well, you can just figure this out yourself. That's good. No. What's the answer to this? Well, the answer is that somehow this, the desire for comfort or fun, or this, the desire for security, cannot be number one in your heart and your life. For her, that desire for security has to be in context of her identity in Christ. His desire for comfort, for fun, has to be inside of his identity for Christ. It can't have outsized importance in his mind and his heart because that's what's causing the conflict. Now, I don't have time to unravel this whole thing, but you see how this works. You see in real life, James 1 and 2, or James 4, 1 and 2. What is the source of wars and fights from among you? Don't they come from your passions that wage war inside of you? You desire and you do not have, therefore you murder and you covet. Becomes a fight. Becomes an argument. It becomes a quarrel with your spouse. So we see inward agitation, outward instigation, and the third layer of this is upward frustration. And so the passions that war inside of us causes an inward problem, it causes an outward problem, and it causes an upward problem. And this is where we're going to basically have to stop and pick up next week how this works out. But look what it says just briefly at the end of verse 2. You do not have because you do not ask. You do not have because you do not ask. Now, he's not necessarily accusing them of prayerlessness. He's accusing them of praying for the wrong thing. He's accusing them of praying to fulfill the desires. And so there's a problem, there's a fight, there's a quarrel in the marriage, and he prays, Lord, please help her to see that it's okay to spend this money. She says, Lord, please help him to understand that we need to save more for retirement. And James says, neither of you are getting what you want because you're praying for the wrong thing. You see, you're praying for each other instead of praying for your own heart and your own desires. Someone says it like this: prayer isn't a way to get what we want. Instead, prayer is a way for us to be brought into what God wants for us. And so when he says, you do not have because you do not ask, what he's saying is you're not asking for the right thing. What should that prayer look like? Instead of praying, Lord, heal me from this disease, we should say, Lord, please grow me through this disease. Instead of praying, Lord, please help my kid to get better grades, we should pray, Lord, please help my kid to do his best and glorify you. Instead of praying, Lord, bring peace to my marriage and make him more attentive to my needs, you should pray, Lord, please grow me and make me the agent of peace in this marriage. You do not have because you do not ask. Inward, outward, upward. Next week, we continue to see how our prayers can go awry. Then James gets very bold here in verse 4, and he calls them adulterers, cheating on God. We're going to work this out the rest of the way and see how this kind of comes around next week. But for now, if you would take a Connect card out, appreciate you filling out a Connect card. You can scan the code on the screen. You can grab a Connect card from the pew rack in front of you. And I would love for you to write a prayer request down. Love for you to think and pray just for a moment. Just give a little bit of thought here as you sit in the pew this morning. Give some thought to the conflicts, the wars, and the fights that are in your life. And try to identify the desire behind that, the desire that you are trying to protect, that's causing the battle in your heart, the battle with others, the battle ultimately you're waging with God. Just take a moment. Write that down. We'd love to pray for you. Ask for help if you need help. We'd love to address some of those needs in your life. So let me give you a second. We'll pray and sing here.